Olá, como vai? Tudo bem? Seja muito bem-vindo, muito bem-vinda ao nosso 38º colóquio de Educação Linguística Crítica. Meu nome é Kleber Aparecida Silva, eu sou professor aqui da Universidade de Brasília e um dos coordenadores do grupo de pesquisa GECAL, Grupo de Estudos Críticos e Avançados em Linguagem. Eu coordeno esse grupo juntamente com minha querida amiga Paula Cobulci, da Faculdade de Educação da Universidade de Brasília. Sejam muito bem-vindos. Hoje nós teremos um imenso prazer, uma grande satisfação de receber um grande pesquisador, o professor David Gramling, da British Columbia University, no Canadá, que vai discutir com a gente um pouquinho sobre Linguacene. Para que a gente possa iniciar os trabalhos, eu gostaria de convidar a minha querida amiga, a professora do IFMG, né, que é a Instituto Federal de Ouro Preto, né, que é a professora Silvia Pena, que irá mediar os trabalhos então. Silvia, é um imenso prazer que nós teremos hoje de receber o professor David Gramling e é um imenso prazer de ter você como mediadora desse colóquio. Seja muito bem-vinda, Silvia. É um imenso prazer que a gente vai iniciar mais uma atividade do GECAL.
Kleber, boa tarde, Kleber. Boa tarde a todos. É um prazer e uma honra estar aqui. Obrigada pelo convite, pela confiança. E eu acho que nós vamos ter uma conversa muito interessante, porque tem tudo a ver com decolonialidade, que é a nossa área de pesquisa, não é? Linguagem, decolonialidade. E o professor David traz algumas coisas muito interessantes que vão, eu acho, vão se alinhar com o que a gente tem estudado.
Ah, que ótimo. Então, pode ficar bem à vontade, Silvio. O palco é todo seu. Aí, se você puder apresentar o nosso ilustre convidado, eu acho que todos nós da audiência iremos aprender muito nesse colóquio. Seja muito bem-vindo, Silvia.
Muito obrigada. Eu preparei um slide para apresentar o professor David Gramling. Então, eu vou ler um pouquinho para que vocês o conheçam melhor. Então, Head of the Department of Central, Eastern and Northern European Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Among his major contributions to the study of multilingualism and language ideology, he's written some, and actually many books. I'm going to mention some of them. The Invention of Monolingualism in 2016 received the American Association for Applied Linguistics Book Award in 2018. Also, The Invention of Multilingualism in 2021 and Literature in Late Monolingualism, 2024. Can you move on, Tamara, please? Thank you. The themes in which he researches are applied linguistics, decolonial approaches, gender, queer, and intersectionality studies, intercultural communication, language, and literacy studies, linguistics, literature studies, translation, and reception studies. He also is a member of editorial boards of Transgender Studies Quarterly and the German Quarterly, and as a founding editor of the Critical Multilingualism Studies. Professor, welcome. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here. I have to say we were very intrigued by everything you were proposing, and I find it very interesting and challenging.
Well, Sylvia, thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. It's really, really nice to meet you. Tamara, it's very nice to meet you. Kleber, we're meeting for the first time, so this is a wonderful way for me to kind of end my week on a Friday and get ready for the weekend. And so spending some time with you is really exciting to me. So, and I really look forward to visiting with the members of GICAL in person sometime. At University of Brasilia, so this is something for me to look forward to in the future. So for now, it's just great that we get a chance to kind of chat online, and so I think I'm going to try to go to my slides if that's okay, Tamara. Very
Sure.
Good. Thank you so much.
Go ahead.
And so I just came back from a talk at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, where I got a chance to kind of reflect on these three books right here that I wrote about monolingualism and multilingualism. And so it's really great to turn a page a little bit with you today and focus on something that I've been writing about since that first book, The Invention of Multilingualism, which is the concept of a linguacene. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. At the ILA World Congress in 2027 in Vancouver, British Columbia, I'll be giving a keynote talk about the linguacene and about linguistic aspects of environmental disaster and environmental injustice, and also about the general relationship between multilingualism and climate emergency. So you are, JICAL is one of the first groups that I've had the opportunity to consult with as I begin to prepare for that talk next summer, and I'm sure a book will come out of it at some point. And of course, I was at ILA in 2017 when it was in Barra da Tijuca in Rio de Janeiro, and so I'm aware in a very initial emerging sense of the immense critical power of Brazilian applied linguistics. And so I'm very, very eager to get to know this group better. And I should mention at the beginning, I think this is actually really relevant, that I am actually a languages teacher. So when I go to work teaching languages. And so that is at some sense at the very base of all my writing. I am always a language teacher. This year I've been teaching a 93 student first semester German class. And so, you know, every sentence I write in these books are since 2016 about multilingualism and monolingualism, et cetera, ties back to this endeavor of cultivating, you know, emergent speakers of additional languages in classroom context. You know, the thing that we do, you know, teaching languages. So I'm very, very invested in that. But that endeavor, you know, teaching languages in classrooms has changed so massively in the 10 years since I first wrote that first book. And so it's been, I've been really it's been a wild ride. And so I've been kind of chasing all the new, you know, the new things that have been happening since then. And I'm convinced that so this right in the middle is a book that I really love by Raj Patel and Jason Moore, and it's called A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. And the 7 cheap things that Raj Patel and Jason Moore talk about are nature, money, work, care, food, energy, and lives. And I'm really convinced that in the story of these 7 things that had to be made cheap in the history of global capitalism, that it is long overdue to add an 8th thing to that list. And that would be language. That would be the manufacture of cheap language and cheap meaning. And I think we're right now in 2025, 2026, in a really key kind of moment for the cheapening of meaning. So each of the books that I've written in the last 10 years has been kind of chasing a wave of really surprising new forms and intensities around monolingualism and monolingual multilingualism. So I think multilingualism can be it can model itself off of monolingualism. It can be reactionary, it can be conservative, it can be repressive. There are forms of multilingualism that are repressive in nature. And so I've been really interested in seeing how these things, monolingualism and multilingualism, have interacted with economies of commodity valuation, as well as visions of proper citizenship. So, you know, various models seem to have been, in the last 10, 20 years, have been being kind of soft launched, beta tested, diffused, and socialized by states, by industries, and by global institutions over the past 3 decades. And it occurred to me that, you know, the celebratory mood around multilingualism and multiculturalism that we had enjoyed in the late 1990s had been really replaced by new effective technologies of securitarian conformism and administrative state power targeting multilingual immigrants and multilingual subjects, particularly by what I called in 2009 a jus linguarum, so a method of adjudicating citizenship based on, you know, assessing alleged linguistic performance, basically by assessing someone's commitment to monolingualism. rather than in previous citizenship models, blood quantum or territorial birth claims to citizenship. I'm really not aware how citizenship works in Brazil, so maybe we can talk about that in the period after. But those predominant models, a jus sanguinis, a law of blood, versus a jus soli, a law of territory. So this newly evolving linguistic model of civic belonging and proper consumer behavior was not designed to engineer or maintain a uniform ethnic essence per se. It wasn't ethnic nationalism, but a jus linguarum implicitly acknowledged the plurality of languages spoken among a given populace, but resorted to segregative and repressive strategies in order to minimize the effect of multilingualism on public life. So it was upholding a kind of cultural diversity, a monolingual cultural diversity, while discouraging the public use of multiple languages. And so this jus linguarum, this kind of cosmopolitan monolingualism, is reactive and reactionary in nature as a public policy strategy. And it's rooted, however, paradoxically, in the recognition that multilingualism has become a societal norm. So what I've been kind of trying to track throughout almost my whole career is that these 30 years since 1990, now 36 years, which is a window spanning the rollout and refinement of algorithmic cross-linguistic information retrieval capacities and machine translation. These have been technologies that have been created by states, economic designers, supply-side logistics personnel, and industry leaders, and they have ushered in a really new age in matters of language and meaning for us all. So I've adapted a concept of a historical period called the Linguacene, and I've adopted that from a designation widely accepted in the natural sciences and now widely used in the humanities and elsewhere in social sciences, of an age called the Anthropocene. So some geologists tend to date that to 1712, the year 1712, and the invention of the steam engine, the Newcomen atmospheric steam engine, though there's a lot of debate about, the periodization and the validity of that date. But the Anthropocene, as geologists and stratigraphers have understood it, is an era of geological time when human societies and our burning of coal, natural gas, and oil began to exert an actual structural effect on the planet, on its biospheres, and on conditions for the persistence and survival and well-being of humans and all other species. So in a parallel fashion, I define the Linguacene as an era of human history, which is a late subset of the Anthropocene in a certain sense, since around 1990, in which the technocratic supply-side coordination among planetary languages and their meanings via machine translation, etc., has become a viable precondition, an enabling and necessary precondition for global industrial and commercial traffic, and that has a lot of downstream consequences for all of us who speak languages every day. It is an era in which such multilingual coordination among major planetary languages becomes a primary location for the extraction of new forms of capital and control, an era in which such supply-side algorithmic coordination among languages begins to terraform the world through the industrialization of translatability, and which in turn shapes the future of our species and all others, and in which a form of reactionary, neo-colonial, and small c conservative multilingualism itself begins to co-participate in shaping Earth's future. And so I believe that the Anthropocene as an analytic has long needed this kind of linguistic component. But leading theorists of the Anthropocene have been very hesitant to provide it. And this is not a mere matter of disciplinary perspective or empirical focus, but I think a broad analytical problem. And so the word Linguacene is in some ways designed to shift the focus for a moment away from the Anthropocene as an allegedly non-linguistic situation, not out of any disagreement with the merits of the concept of the Anthropocene, nor out of a kind of fatigue with its centrality in scholarly conversations, but rather the thrust of an argument about the Linguacene is one in favor of a more honest and rigorous dealing with language and translation as a symbolic order that has historically propelled and enabled and accelerated all of the material processes described under the historical umbrella of the Anthropocene. So all of the human industry and all of the activity that has led the planet to where it is today have had to be linguistically articulated, often in a colonizer's language, and then exported in the form of translation and language brokering, language mediation, filtered through complexly multilingual and often violent labor industrial systems in colonized lands, and then controlled and monitored in scores of subjugated colonized languages. So if colonial multilingualism hadn't been so effective, there would have been little likelihood, for example, that the East India Company, for example, would have been so effectively able to break the commercial customs of the textile industry in the late 17th century in the shadow of the Mughal Empire in Bengal. So colonization really had to work effectively with multilingualism. And of course, genocidal displacements of indigenous nations to make room for cotton and tobacco and silver industries in the Americas could not have succeeded without massive communicative enterprises involving multilingual translation between colonial and indigenous languages. So whereas Anthropocene discourses often look to the coal and steam inventions of the 18th century as a pivotal point in the establishment of the age of anthropogenic climate change and geological change, a Linguacene approach would go back even further, exploring the intensity of translations that led up to the invention itself. So, for example, here on the screen, Hero of Alexandria's Aeolipile, as documented in his Pneumatica of 62 of the Common Era, was the subject of frequent translation in 15th and 16th century Italy, moving northward via Italian, French, German, and so that 17th century England would be able to fund and consolidate a growing discourse on steam power. And even the founding of the Royal Society of London in the 1660s was brought to us by, among others, a man named John Wilkins, whose book Mathematical Magic was inspired in part by the excitement of about the translation of Hero of Alexandria's steam technology out of the Greek. And so this attention to this kind of multilingual means of industrial production is a much different way of conceptualizing the Anthropocene and of multilingualism, to be honest, than subscribing to a tacit indifference towards language as a materially enabling condition. And given that all of Britain's industrial advancements and innovations were tied to domestic resource crises, for example, crises around a dearth of wood, and that the solutions for those crises were always linguistically and fiscally forged on the multilingual imperial frontier in the Americas and in India and elsewhere, language was never external to the key dynamics of political economy. And in this sense, we should likely add multilingual epistemic prospecting as a fourth dimension to what D'Annunzio and Dow call the three major omissions in the historical account of global capitalism, alongside the financial revolution and the creation of the Bank of England, the transition to coal energy, and the capitalization of the state as it relates to international warfare, colonization, and Atlantic slavery. So I would like to add multilingual prospecting as a fourth kind of silence at the core of the way we talk about global capitalism. And one doesn't even need to leave Europe to find evidence of such industrious silencing of indigenous and colonized epistemologies and multilingualisms in the historical record of global capitalism. So we can consider the 19th century British-owned Alton Copper Works. That's a photo that's to the right here on the slide, which was a copper mine by a remote fjord near today's town of Alta in northern Norway, in Sápmi, indigenous Sápmi, which recruited a multilingual workforce from Cornwall in England, northern Finland, and also indigenous Sami workers. And so the Alton Copper Works directors became kind of active policymakers and brokers between national politics, migrant workers, and the surrounding communities. And against the agenda of national politics, they protected their employees from assimilation policies and supported linguistic diversity. But they did that with, economic success for the copper works as the primary rationale. And so their engagement in diversity issues positioned them as exploiting the linguistically diverse situation of their workers to the company's advantage. So maintaining ethno-linguistic diversity among the workers, contrary to the national policies of Norway at the time, helped them to keep wages down, to prevent labor organizing, and to secure an always flexible supply of laborers. And so this is not merely something that happened throughout transatlantic colonization. This is also something that happened in Europe. The success of companies like Alton Copper Works hinged on its ability to recruit and also to disenfranchise labor groups from southern Scandinavia, from Finnmark, from Sápmi, from Cornwall, in such a way that those laborers could not effectively mobilize for higher wages. This is actually something going on right now in Greeley, Colorado. That's a state in the United States. This is the bottom left photo on your screen. This is one of the largest meatpacking factories in the United States right now. Its massively multilingual workforce is organizing and protesting labor conditions, but it's having a hard time doing it because of its own, the multilingualism of its workforce. So this is something that I'm really, really interested in as a mainstay of kind of colonial political economy. So I'm suggesting that we course correct and reframe matters in this way when it comes to language ideology and political economy. Complementing existing Anthropocene debates with a bid for a more linguistically and translationally aware set of inquiries and historical analyses. So establishing the practical linguistic underpinnings of Anthropocene processes will be a really crucial component, I think, of how we talk about the structural relationship between industry and its climate effects in economics, but also in applied linguistics. And also it will change the way we talk about the relationship between languages and material culture, between languages and labor, and also languages and politics. I don't know about y'all, but in my world, language teaching is usually very, very depoliticized. It's something that the European Common European Framework of Reference kind of is framed around the depoliticization of languages. And I think that we accept those conditions to our detriment. So it will be a major improvement, I think, to acknowledge the materially consequential mediating function that languages have played in accumulating the specific kind of shock-driven Anthropocene that we live in today. And standardized language itself has moved from being an industrial enabler of economic globalism in the 18th century to what it has become since 1990, which is a newly separate domain of commodities sold and bought by machine translation and artificial intelligence corporations, and is being financialized in the economic sense according to which clients want to harness language for their own proprietary purposes. And so the modern technical affordances that yielded such an effective commoditization of language by way of certain kinds of monolingualisms, certain kinds of reactionary multilingualisms and the like, they were born in the 1940s. And they experience with the birth of machine translation, and they experience variously comical booms and busts throughout the ensuing quarter century through the 60s and 70s, when machine translation was really kind of stumbling. But they only hit their stride in the 1990s with corpus-based machine translation. And ever since then, I've been really, really struck by the profound underestimation of the practical centrality of languages that pervades and even structures entire fields of analysis, including economics, around Anthropocene phenomena, but also just around economic phenomena in general. Economics has had very little to say about language, from the 17th century physiocrats all the way to neoclassical approaches in the 20th century. And yet, anthropologists like Arjun Appadurai argue that the entire 2008 financial collapse was in fact a crisis of language and not just of markets. The way we talked about value actually, crashed. So the Linguacene is unfortunately an era in which the absence of strong critical public ideas about language widen the space for potential manipulation and extraction. And of course, the US President Donald Trump is a great example of someone who exploits that, those gaps and that widening opportunity for extraction and manipulation, given that the US has a relatively indifferent culture around language and multilingualism. So I adapt this concept of the Linguacene in order to suggest that the global large-scale industrialization of translation and multilingual extraction is redoubling global industrial damages and injustices rather than counteracting them, for example, with green innovations or something. And though we are traditionally accustomed to thinking about translation and translatability as a virtue, capable of improving communication between cultures and of breaking down inequities, barriers, and injustices, the Linguacene is actually a historical period in which translatability is effectively put in the service of industries that tend to exploit and create global inequities rather than tackling them. And so the focus on materiality and practical action in economics and international relations has usually detracted from those fields' willingness to consider the linguistic and symbolic features of materiality and industry. And major thinkers in Anthropocene discourse like Andreas Malm have called for a new line of thinking about literature and the textual archive as regards fossil fuels, for example. But those leading thinkers fall short of thinking about languages themselves as part of the engine fueling extractive industries. For example, Andreas Malm sees fossil fuel fiction, that's his term, like Lawrence, D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover from 1928, as providing a kind of a window onto the oil economy in the 1920s. That's kind of how he sees the value of literature. But he does not recognize languages as, part of an assemblage that actually propels and necessitates that oil economy. And so languages are allowed to be key witnesses to the economy, but not necessarily part of it. So it's time, I think, for critics to break that plate glass window, separating language from the rest of political economy. And that really does involve, I think, repoliticizing languages in new ways, if for no other reason than that global industrialists have already done this. They have found language as a financializable commodity stream. They did so about 40 years ago. And so we need a whole new way of thinking about this that kind of catches up to what industry already has done throughout this period of the Linguacene. So translational monolingualism as an accelerant of multilingual cross-border commerce is, of course, not a novelty of the 20th century. There is ample evidence that in the 17th and 18th century, innovative expertise and entrepreneurial authority in the development of technologies, including fossil fuel-driven ones, required intensive consolidation and commensuration of technical discourses in multiple languages. And so researching the geography of multiple language standardization and the Industrial Revolution in the 17th and 18th centuries in Northern Europe, the economist Leonard Dudley notes that prior to the beginning of the modern period in the West, there were barriers to innovation caused by the difficulty of communicating with those who were neither kin nor neighbors. And so, as Dudley details, very few of the collaborative innovations that succeeded before or between 1600 and 1800, whether a loom, coded with punch cards in Lyon in 1728, or a steam-powered wagon in Paris in the 1770s, a parachute in 1783 in Montpellier, or an iron smelter with coke in Birmingham in 1709, none of these would have been possible without standardized and standardizing monolanguages to pave the way for trans-regional, trans-local exchange of practical information among inventors and industrialists. Literacy itself, so the ability to read, individual genius, and imagination, none of these were enough on their own. High literacy rates didn't mean much for industrial innovation. What they needed was a standardized language for translocal collaboration and communication. And so by focusing on these cooperative versus non-cooperative innovations, Dudley is able to show how some 3/4 of the important innovations cited by historians of technology were developed in 3 narrow bands of territory in England, northern France, and the United States. Other regions in the West with similar institutions or higher levels of literacy frequently failed to generate those types of industrial innovations during the century and a half prior to 1850. And of course, those were the innovations or inventions, the industrial innovations that gave us the kind of Anthropocene effects, the climate disaster that we're dealing with today. Those are just some of the questions that I'm mostly interested in these days and kind of working through. And I think I'm going to stop now and just, turn it back over to Sylvia and maybe our other guests. And I'd just like to, talk with you and see where it goes from here. So thank you so much. I'm going to try to unshare my screen at this point. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor. It has been really enlightening. And, it also surprised me to see how the role of language has been so underestimated. I am also a language teacher, and language is so political. It has everything to do with culture, politics, and I think it's great that you have just brought it up, and we can talk about it, look at it, and talk about it. I would like, we have some questions from the audience. Tamara, would you be able to project them here? From Kleber, if language has always been a tool of power, is the dream of new translation fundamentally an illusion? Yes.
Oh, wow. I think so. I think absolutely. I mean, I'm also a translator, so I do translate from Turkish to English, literary translation. I do book-length literary translation. I try not to talk about things that I don't do. You know what I mean? I try not to. So translation is something that I talk about because I do it, and I don't think that neutral translation exists, and I think that's a very good thing, because I think that the kind of late capitalist political economy that we're working in really wants there to be this kind of globally isomorphic system of equivalent languages that you can send commodities back and forth with instantaneously without much trouble. It's modeling the world language system on the world banking system, which was more or less invented in the 1930s by the ordoliberals of that period. And so this kind of dream of a globally kind of frictionless exchange of neutral translation is a hallucination of late capitalism. It's something that industrialists are chasing very eagerly. It's a gold rush to find ways to neutralize languages and make other languages unnecessary, and that's a lot of what the AI industry is trying to do, is to kind of free us from the Tower of Babel. And I think that I think it's a hallucination. I think that that the world's 7,000 plus languages are, for me, the languages themselves are the key to truth. You can only get to truth by going through the kind of prism, the constellation of all of these languages and all of their meanings. That's the only way we get to an actual truth in the world. And relying on only one, or relying on the idea of equivalence between languages, is a mistake and a kind of a farce. So I'm really interested, for example, in the European Court of Justice, because what they do, they have 24 justices who all speak they speak different languages. And so when they're trying to adjudicate a legal claim, they will compare the law written in Danish and Italian and Swedish in order to figure out what the law really means. And so what they're doing is they're doing something called Augustinian interpretation. So this comes from St. Augustine, the idea that in order to know what scripture really meant, what the Bible really meant, you had to look at the Greek, the Latin, the Hebrew, the Aramaic all together. And so this is the kind of activity that I think we need to promote more of. I think, who is it? Is it Viveros de Castro that talks about controlled equivocation? So a way of finding meanings in the relationship between languages, instead of trying to hallucinate neutrality and equivalence between them. So that's my thought about that question. But I don't know, Kleber, what do you think?
Kleber, would you be able to answer written, or you want to speak? You're free to speak. Join us.
Oh, I just want to learn with Gramling. It was fantastic, your position. I really appreciate it, David. Thank you.
All right. I had prepared some questions based on what I've read, and I would like to start by asking, the concept of the Linguacene places language at the center of the material dynamics of global capitalism. To what extent does this imply rethinking applied linguistics, not as only an interpretive field, but also as an infrastructure one?
Well, Sylvia, that I'm going to turn the question back to you because I want to know what you think about it. But I'm a huge fan of infrastructure studies. I want to know how global structures of exchange, supply side management, logistics, etc., in every different kind of commodity takes place, and how symbolic commodities get exported from one place to another, how rights, so foreign corporations, how they assert rights towards not only material property and control in jurisdictions that are outside their national territory, but also how they assert discursive rights. So how do you get a person like Steve Bannon or Donald Trump or these other people exporting entire discourses into other languages and then demanding that they be taken up by those languages, local authorities? So I remember back to the George W. Bush administration and the kind of the war on terror kind of idea, and how did the discourse of the war on terror get to Turkey, for example, so that you would see police officers going around Turkey with these vests on that said "Terror le mücadele." So it was a direct translation of war on terror. So there is this is something I call supralingualism. So the way that a powerful global language is able to kind of pump discourses and meanings multilaterally into other languages, and then insist that those languages take up those discourses. And then interestingly, the hegemon then uses the evidence of those discourses' existence in other languages as a proof of the legitimacy of the original term. It's a fascinating kind of procedure of mythologization, to use Roland Barthes' term. And so all of that, what I'm super fascinated about, and I'm going to turn it back over to you, Sylvia, is what infrastructures, discursive, human resources, technologies, conference kind of circuits, et cetera, do those things need in order for that infrastructure of language, of supralingual language exchange to take place? How does, I'm very interested in the COPs, the council, the conference of, what are those things? The United Nations Council of Participants in Climate Change. How that kind of moving conference that was just in Brazil, how all the personnel that come to those places, including the oil executives and lobbyists and stuff, what is their infrastructure of language and discourse, and what supports and funds those particular infrastructures? Can you add some things to that I didn't mention?
Well, I am not sure I can add a lot, but maybe a little bit. Since I have been researching on critical applied linguistics, I have been thinking a lot about the role of language. And yes, the infrastructure is something that is fascinating because it's everywhere, as you said, everywhere. It comes from everywhere, everyone. And I think what really intrigues me is because it is so paradoxical, as you said, for example, it can be used for spreading hate discourse and manipulating people's minds towards something, power wants, people in power want. But also, as you said, how can we are at the same time able to get together and work on language? Different people, different cultures, but we are able to, somehow entangle all of the interests that we have together. So this is something that still intrigues me. I don't have really an answer for you, but that's something that was, I had in mind as I was reading your material and hearing you now. Okay, we have a question from Professor Neil Delago. In the age of the Linguacene, how can literacy criticism rethink its own ways of reading without reproducing those same assumptions?
Thank you, Neil. In the late age of the Linguacene, how can literary criticism rethink its own ways of reading without reproducing those same assumptions? It's very difficult. I'm a little bit unsure about the status of literary criticism here, because I just finished writing a book. It came out in 2024 called Literature in Late Monolingualism. And that book was about how literary authors themselves are aware of the Linguacene as a phenomenon. They're aware of reactionary multilingualism. They're aware, for example, Swedish writers and Danish writers, they're aware of the immense power of Anglocentricity and the English language market to kind of shape the ways that they are supposed to write. And so what I tried to do in that book was to look at, writers writing in languages like Turkish or Danish or Swedish, and I imagine also in Portuguese, and looking at the way the makers of literature are already themselves conscious of the relationship between languages, multilingualism, and climate, and also industry. and that sometimes the books themselves will tell that story. So sometimes, I'm a literary critic too, and sometimes we get clever and we think that we know something that the writers of these books don't know, and so we go and find that thing in their books. But I think my approach was to say, look, these are actually, I was working on China Mieville, Dorte Noors, Karen Tietbeck, and Neil Stevenson, those 4 authors. And what I said to myself is, as a literary critic, I said to myself, wow, these people are already very, very aware of how the Linguacene works, how the relationship between languages, industries, extractivism, colonialism, how it all works. And they are writing these books in order to tell us how it works. So in some ways, I think that literary critics can go looking for the stories that really tell us how this works. And sometimes novels are the best place to look for the details, the history, the details, the subtleties, the nuances, the counter evidence, the things that that don't fit into everyday, kind of common sense ideas about language and economics, etc. Because we cannot get any honest accounting about these questions from economics. We can't go to economics people. Even my favorite economists will not talk about this with me. The multilingualism and industry and its kind of relationships. So sometimes I find, and I'm curious what your experience is, Nu, that novels themselves are some of the best places to go for a really critical and very detailed account, historical account of the Linguacene in particular sites and places. Neil Stevenson's novel Cryptonomicon, for example, written in 1999 already, that's a long time ago. The way he spells out the production and establishment and founding of the corporations that kind of gave us the Linguacene, gave us machine translation as we have it, it's an extraordinarily powerful novel. I hate it. It's not a novel I like because it's very misanthropic. It's very sexist. There's a lot of things I don't like about the novel, but it tells a really impressive and illuminating story about the Linguacene and about late monolingualism. So those are some of my initial thoughts on that.
Well, she has just answered you, Professor, thanking you. And she says, I think literary criticism may need a stronger suspicion of its own inherited scales of legibility, especially those that equate depth, coherence, and aesthetic value with monolingual norms.
Yeah, thank you. The whole book that I wrote was about that literature does not like to think of itself as monolingual. That is a nightmare for literature. Literature loves to think of itself as heteroglossic, multilingual, etc. And it hides from the fact that, at least novelistic literature, hides from the fact that it relies profoundly and almost exclusively on monolingual forms in order to get published, to get marketed, to get kind of taken up in the national imaginary, etc. And so in some ways, literary authors really are themselves relying on monolingualism much more than everyday speakers do. And I think that is a fact that is very, very unpopular, not only in kind of literary culture, but also certainly among comparative literature scholars and English professors who oftentimes really don't want to acknowledge the deep historical conspiracy between literary culture and monolingualism. I think that might be exactly what you were saying with your response, Nu. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, we are ready for question 2. The concept of the Linguacene seems to emphasize the integration of language into global capitalism. Is there space within this framework for forms of language practice that resist or escape this logic?
Yeah. So I've been reading, as a lot of people have been reading, this kind of big, long history of capitalism by Sven Beckert called Capitalism, A Global History. It's 1,300 pages long. It's basically an endless history of capitalism that starts in the 11th century. I'm also a huge fan of the historian Quinn Slobodian and his books, Crack Up Capitalism, and The Globalists, which is about the kind of historical rise of neoliberalism since the 1930s. And of course, I'm astonished and frustrated that in those very, very good books, language almost never appears. It certainly doesn't appear as a central matter. And I understand that I have a little bit of a prejudice here. I'm a language person. I'm an applied linguist, and so I want language to be in the middle of everything. But I don't think that we're trying to push our issue into the middle because we like our issue. I think we're trying to say, look, analytically speaking, language and multilingualism have been and monolingualism, of course, have been absolutely critical to the success of capitalism for the last 1,000 years, since it kind of got going in Yemen in the mid 11th century. And merchant cultures had to be multilingual. They had to be able to mediate between languages. And but it's a part of the story that really is left to the side, and that is frustrating because I am not trained as an economic historian, and I don't want to have to do all that work. And I wish that economists and historians would do that work for us, and so we could read their books and see language and kind of symbolic power. Kind of in a Bourdieusian sense, be a little bit more at the center of their analytic. And so it is always kind of frustrating for me to see how that doesn't happen. The question is about resistance. Is there space within this framework for forms of language practice that resist or escape this logic? Absolutely. So, I've recently written about translanguaging in a book, the Handbook of Translanguaging that Li Wei put together with Jerry Lee and Ophelia Garcia. I'm sometimes skeptical because there's forms of translanguaging and code mixing that really serve the needs of exploitation and extractivism. There's kinds of code switching and translanguaging, the friend shoring of languages, for example, that global capitalism and oligarchy and extractivism absolutely need and want. And so I'm really interested in finding out, what kinds of resistance practices are actually really effective at undermining those infrastructures, because we're going to need them. We're really going to need them in the next 25 years. And we need to be careful not to say that all translanguaging, all code mixing, for example, is virtuous and regime critical and critical of political economy. I found that there are certain forms of translanguaging that late capitalism really, really loves. And so in terms of resistance practices, the answer is absolutely yes. But we have to come to a more specific and kind of critical sense of what types of resistance practices are effective. And sometimes they don't even have to be effective. They can simply be true to the communities that they come from. So, for example, indigenous communities whose linguistic sovereignty has been under attack for 600 years, sometimes their monolingualism, as in, we don't want any of your colonial language anywhere near our language. We don't want your advice. We don't necessarily even want your dictionary makers helping us to make our dictionaries. We are just fine, thank you very much. That kind of resistance practice is a type of sovereignty that, regardless of whether it's effective on the global scale as a kind of geopolitical intervention, I truly value that. And so there's a there's an indigenous a scholar named Eve Tuck who talks about rematriating languages. So the way that you rematriate languages into the actual values and needs of your community, rather than those of global capitalism or of the state or of colonial power, et cetera. I really, really love that idea of rematriating languages. Those are resistance practices too, and they're maybe quieter, they're more local, but for the next 100 years, we're going to have to keep, honoring and believing in those kinds of practices as really powerful forms of resistance as well. So the answer is absolutely yes.
Well, as you mentioned, translanguaging, which is something that really interests me because I'm just doing research on that. And in a micro level, I was observing and analyzing students from Brazil and the US and their interactions and how language works, the trying legitimacy, power, and it's a very interesting topic. But I was thinking, one of the things that immediately I could see is that translanguaging, it's not only about resistance. As you said, I could see there how they would use translanguaging for the same search for power, for being, I am the one speaking, you shut up. It's there. And that is something that really, it did not really surprise me, but it opened, a window for me to start looking at that. Everybody looks at translanguage as something like really new. It is a new concept, and there's a lot still to be developed. But this is something we have to look like very closely into, exactly because if we look at it at a macro level, that's different. But in these little situated speeches, it's very easy to see how they can manipulate it. So, well, I think we have one more question by Kleber. Does the industrialization of translatability liberate global communication, or does it quietly standardize and control thought across culture?
Oh boy. We're all doing our best, I think, right now in this strange moment that we're living in. As I mentioned, I'm teaching German right now. So all of the stuff that I'm talking about is proof tested for me in my own classroom with 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds, 22-year-olds who are there to learn German. They want to learn an additional language. There's very little at the university that is actually compelling them to do that. They want to do it. So am I going to tell them that they cannot use artificial intelligence and machine translation in their class assignments? Absolutely not. I'm not going to do that. I'm 50 years old. It would be a problem for me to tell 20-year-olds you cannot use this tool that has emerged. So what we do is we see, this is, for me, this is about critiquing while also partaking, because once these students leave the university, they are not going to be prompted by anyone to critique these tools, these platforms of industrialized translatability. And so now is the opportunity to have the conversations about it, and to have those conversations every day, because as soon as they graduate, they're poof off into their jobs. No one is going to talk to them about this ever again, unless they seek out the conversation. So I'm really trying to, for example, yesterday in my German class, I said, look, for your final essay for this class, I want you to write half of it using artificial intelligence, as in using a Google Translate, and I want you to use half of it without using that. And then I want you to compare your voice as it appears to you in the non-AI, non-machine translated version versus the one that you used machine translation for, and then see the differences between those voices. And so I think that maybe the liberation comes in raising these questions up for intensive everyday conversations as part of the education that we're doing, and saying, we trust you as young adults to think about these things very deeply and in detail, and to have a conversation together as a group about these things. There are people in my classes who absolutely refuse to use any kind of machine translation tool whatsoever because of its environmental burdens, because of its kind of right-wing corporate ownership, etc. And so there's a real diversity of views about this among my students. And so I think what I'm trying to do is to not come in the room, the language classroom, either the applied linguistics classroom, which is my 11 o'clock class, or my 2 o'clock German language classroom, and tell them industrial translation, translatability, machine translation is bad, you're not allowed to use it. Or to say, oh, the march of progress requires us to take on this new tool, here we go, here's how to use it. So I don't want to be blithely instrumentalist about it, nor be a kind of Luddite that refuses it from the outset. And because I teach on Indigenous land, Musqueam land here in Vancouver, I also try to, to use available teachings, Musqueam teachings, about how to make a decision about adopting or not adopting a new technology. And there's guidance about that from our Indigenous elders about, how does an Indigenous nation make decisions about whether or not to take up a modern technology or not. And so just, having all of those types of deliberations in the room, I think should help these 20-year-olds prepare for what is coming, which is a mid-21st century where they're in charge, and it's going to be absolutely wild, and they're going to need to have the kind of discernment and decision-making capacity that we as university instructors get to kind of help promote for them. So that would be my answer to that question, is having the conversation now in its really bold and detailed way is the way that we do our job best as educators.
Well, I agree with you when you say that school is the place to do that, definitely. And your critical approach to help them see, what they're able to do and what the artificial intelligence would show, that is fantastic. Because what concerns me, makes me worried, is the fact that my students, they would think that there is this model, and they have to reach up to that model, and everybody would read and write in the same way. And I'm not sure we would run the risk of everybody writing the same way, because they're all using artificial intelligence. But it's very important for them also to see, well, you don't have to go up there at that level. You have to be yourself and develop your own thinking. So definitely a very good critical approach, and I'm going to use it with my students. Thank you for that.
The goal is really, cultivating leaders. These are university students. You cultivate leaders. And what does it mean to be a language leader? That's what we need more of. When Mary Louise Pratt talks about a new public idea about languages, you need leaders in order to do that. And so what I'm trying to engender in them, in these 20-year-olds, is you can become a language leader. You multilingual person who came to this university speaking Dari and Persian and Portuguese and Cree, you're the best person to be a mid-21st century language leader. And so that's what I'm kind of hoping to do.
All right. Some people are thanking you for everything we have been discussing.
Thanks a lot, New.
I would like to thank you very much. It's been a short talk, but I have learned a lot right now. And I would like to invite Cleve back to stage to talk to us. Oh, we can't hear you.
Well, David, it's a pleasure for us, to learn with you today. Well, your talk was simply fantastic. I love it. be assured that your research in Canada inspired us in Brazil to develop a kind of critical research in applied linguistics. Well, one thing that I'd like to talk to you in this moment, Linguacene, the topic, the construct that you defend so well, is the era in the which language ceases to merely a means of communication. It becomes a central infrastructure of global capitalism and transformation of the planet. Of course, that it is necessary in this era to develop more research with in the translanguaging in Linguacene. It's so important to do it. And now I'm sure that your research in Canada inspired us to continue to have this motivation to develop this kind of research in Brazil. And in short time, our group will invite you to come to Brazil. It's an honor for us, to interact personally with you. But now in this opportunity to interact with you virtually, it was great for us. We really appreciate it. Really appreciate it. Your books for us, it is great. The method of monolingualism and the method of multilingualism, you have you critique, so well, to present a strong argument to rethink about what's the multilingualism now in our society. Well, it's so important to have more Davids, to inspire us to develop research.
Well, thank you so much, Kleber. It's really a pleasure and an honor to meet you, and you too, Sylvia. So thank you so much. And I'd love to come see you in person. So let me know.
Yeah. In Brazil or in Canada, I will visit you.
Okay, all right.
Interact with you and Kubota too.
Great.
It will be great.
Okay.
Okay, Sylvia, you want to say something?
Well, just thank everybody for being here. It's very important to discuss about the way Professor Gramling has been researching, and also, pay attention to the ways we have been researching here in the Global South about translanguaging, Ubuntu translanguaging, and decoloniality. And I think we're very much working on the same line. So thank you all. Are we about to finish?
Yep.
Okay. So thank you, Professor, once again. And you're more than welcome to come here and visit us, and we can talk a little more.
Okay.
Tamara?
Okay, thank you so much. And now, Kleber, invite you to the next colloquium, please.
Yes, I will speak in Portuguese so slow. Of course, that David will understand, David. No próximo mês, nós vamos ter a oportunidade de interagir com outro pesquisador. In the next month, you have the opportunity to interact with another great scholar like David. And eu gostaria de contar com sua presença é a presença de seus alunos, a fim de interagir com o nosso ilustre convidado. You have the opportunity, to interact with another great scholar, like you interact with David today. E vai ser um prazer recebê-la, e mais uma vez queria agradecer muito a mediação de Sylvia e a presença de David, e esperamos vocês no próximo mês. I'd like to thank you, Sylvia, for this opportunity to learn with you. They do have the great talk today, and I'd like to invite you to participate with us the next month. The last Friday in the month, you have the opportunity to interact with a great scholar from the different part of the world in applied linguistics, ok? Vai ser um prazer receber vocês aqui, então, tá bom? Muito obrigado, gente. Ótimo dia e tenha uma excelente sexta-feira.